Welcome to the RF Berlin Forum on Migration. My name is Tim Phillips. A group of researchers are meeting here in Germany's capital to discuss their research on this important and contentious topic. I'm here to talk to some of those experts. Forced migration, or forced displacement, has a profound effect on the individuals who leave behind their homes and their lives. How do they adjust and try to do the best for themselves and for their families, wherever they end up? Sandra Sequeira of the London School of Economics and Dominik Hangartner of ETH Zurich have both studied episodes of forced displacement, focusing on the impact of people, young and old, who are displaced, or on their children. Now, there is some good news from this research, but lessons also for the places who receive those refugees. Dominik, welcome.
Pleasure being here. Thank you.
And Sandra as well.
Thanks for having me.
We're talking about human capital, what economists call human capital. So, what actually is human capital?
So economists tend to think about human capital as this set of skills, knowledge that people have that are of value to the economy. So we think of human capital as one of the building blocks of economic development and growth, just like we think about physical capital. But this is the human infrastructure, I guess, of economic growth.
And what's it measured as? How do we commonly measure human capital?
We can use many different measures. The most commonly used are going to be average years of schooling, completion of secondary, tertiary education. We tend to rely on these types of objective measures to try to assess the level of human capital.
Now, we're linking this to forced migration. Why might forced migration affect human capital, either for good or bad?
So forced migration or forced displacement is in itself very disruptive to people's lives. So children, when they're forcibly displaced, are going to be pulled out of school. Adults are going to leave their jobs where they may be acquiring skills as well. That's part of their human capital. And so we often think of forced displacement as being highly disruptive. You might also be pushed into areas where it's difficult to find educational organizations, schools. You might go to areas with low economic growth, so there aren't many job opportunities. And so we tend to think of forced displacement as being very disruptive of human capital investments. On the other hand, there's also the possibility that you move to opportunity. And so being forcibly displaced from your home is pushing you into cities or other towns where you can have better access to schools. You have more incentives to invest in acquiring human capital and completing more years of schooling. So I think it could have both types of effects depending on the type of forced displacement and where people end up moving to.
Dominik, why is this so important, both for the people who are affected, but also for the places in which they live?
There are these two general components that Sandra mentioned, and both of which are important. One is everything related to the uprooting, that you have to leave a place, huge impact. But then eventually and hopefully some of these location-based effects kick in, what Sandra mentioned, as people are moving to opportunities. And so both of these things together, and whether one is bigger than the other is an empirical question and depends on context, but both of these things are incredibly important for the people themselves, the migrants, but also for the societies, including the new host societies where they live. Because whether they can use their human capital to find work and also integrate in the new social and political dimensions is not only important for the forced migrants themselves, but also for the society and the cohesion of those societies. And so we usually tend to think about these things as sort of the corners of a successful integration. And integration here really meaning this two-way street between both the new arrivals, the forced migrants, and the host communities.
You both have very interesting stories to tell that happened in very different places at different times. Sandra, first of all, you studied the civil war in Mozambique. When was this? What happened?
Mozambique gained independence, former colonial power, Portugal, in 1974. And just 3 years later was plunged into a civil war between the Frelimo, which was the Front for Liberation of Mozambique that had fought in the War of Independence, and Renamo, a rebel group. at the time, Renamo was supported by the apartheid regimes in South Africa and by the apartheid regime in Rhodesia as well. So that sustained the war. It was a protracted, devastating civil war, one of the worst in the post-World War II context. It led to the displacement of almost 6 million people. It came to an end in 1992, just when the apartheid regime fell in South Africa and in Zimbabwe. And so that led to peace again.
You said displacement of 6 million people. Hey, it's huge. Where were they originally and where did they go to?
Right. So there was a lot of movement in all directions. There were people displaced from rural areas where primarily the war was fought. So the war did not really reach some of the main cities. And so people were pushed from rural areas into other safer, slightly safer rural areas. Others were pushed into the main coastal cities, including the capital of Maputo. And yet many others were pushed into neighboring countries. So the majority went into refugee camps and informal settlements by the border in Malawi, in Zimbabwe, in South Africa, all the way to Tanzania and other parts of Africa.
And so for many of these people, their lives completely changed.
Right. So at the time, most of these refugees did not have the right to work in neighboring countries. And so the vast majority of them actually stayed closer to the border in other rural areas in UNHCR managed refugee camps. So these would be, the United Nations would set up these managed camps, and that's where most of the refugees ended up staying. And then they were repatriated at the end of the war back to Mozambique.
Right, now to investigate the impacts here, you have to follow the people from where they started to where they finished and connect it to their educational outcomes. How on earth do you do this?
That's incredibly hard to do. So it's notoriously difficult to do this as an empirical researcher, even with conflict happening today, to be able to track people. So let alone thinking about a conflict that took place 30 years ago where there were no data whatsoever on people's movements. So we leverage the first census that took place in the country in 1997. So this was 5 years after the end of hostilities. And this is a unique census because it asked for every person in the household where they were born, where they were right before the war ended, and then where they are in 1997. So in a very coarse way, granted, we are able to create a displacement matrix to try to trace people's paths throughout the war. And that's how we see that people go from rural to rural areas or from rural to urban or rural into refugee camps in neighboring countries.
And measuring these impacts on educational attainments, what did you find?
So there we also rely on census data that tells us in 1997 for the age group that presumably was making decisions to go to school or not during the war. So in 1997, this would be the age group of 12 to 32. And we see how many years of schooling did they manage to complete. So whether in particular they completed primary education or not. That's our key measure that we also obtained from the census. And what we find is that it really depends on where people ended up going during the war. So we find instances of people moving from rural areas to cities where that represented a significant boost in their educational attainment. So perhaps because they have more incentives now to obtain an education, there are more labor market opportunities, so there are higher returns to that education as well. Perhaps the schools are more available and they're better. So that's where we see the largest impact is the movement from rural to urban. But we also see some impact on schooling, even for those who go from one rural area into another rural area, which is not that different. It might be marginally safer, but Mozambique was the third poorest country in the world at time. So we're talking about dire levels of poverty in rural areas. But what is interesting, the way we try to interpret this result of the rural to rural movement being associated with more education is what Dominik already mentioned. So is this hypothesis of uprootedness, that when you are uprooted, there's a tendency or an incentive to invest more in movable capital. So assets that you can take with yourself if you are pushed to move again,
Right.
as opposed to investing in your house or in other assets, physical assets. And we think that this is a good evidence of that. So even when your overall circumstances don't change significantly, the fact that you were uprooted means that you are more likely to then invest in human capital and send your children to school, essentially. Another interesting finding is that we don't see that those who go into refugee camps actually invest more in schooling. We spoke, fortunately, because it was 30 years ago, but we still managed to interview some of the directors of the camps at the time from the UN system. And in their perspective, these places were far better than anything you could find in rural Mozambique at the time, because the schools were actually open. They were run with UN personnel. And yet we don't see that in the data. So we see that the schools were open, but children were not completing primary education. And our interpretation is that this is mostly because they had no incentives to do so. Mm-hmm. There were no job opportunities in the refugee camp. They had no prospects of when they were going to return back and where to. So we really think that the context matters in setting the incentives for people to invest in schooling or not. And that's why understanding the paths that people take during this type of forced displacement, be it because of conflict, be it because of a climate shock, is really important because it will determine how much ultimately they invest in human capital.
As you say, this was a very chaotic situation.
Yes.
Can you be confident in attributing the effects that you find to the displacement and not to all the other life experiences that they would have had?
The way we try to get at that is to focus on meaningful comparisons. So, for instance, we will look at individuals who come from the same district of birth. So presumably the type of disruption that they went through and that pushed them out is going to be similar across all of them. And they simply go in different directions. And so we compare the different paths of essentially very similar people who experience very similar levels of disruption during the war. We try to go beyond that and even look within families where perhaps children are even more comparable. So we take advantage of the fact that families were quite large in Mozambique. So the median number of children would be 6 to 7. We observe members of the same family in the same districts are pushed, we think, quasi-randomly, because it depends on the timing of the conflict events. Some end up in refugee camps, some children from the same family, others end up in cities, others end up in rural areas, and we observe very different paths. And presumably these are individuals from the same family who are quite comparable beforehand. So we think it's not just a disruption of being pushed out of your home, but it's really the place you end up in that is going to determine your decision to invest in education or not.
This was a terrible, devastating war, which had profound effects on millions of people. However, you have found that for certain paths, certain individuals, there was a good news story in this, in that they acquired more human capital. Were there costs with that as well?
Yes, absolutely. I think what our study shows is that there is this silver lining, as you say, that depending on where you go to, you might invest more in education. And so we think of it as a mobility shock, is what other economists have called the gift of moving, that you wouldn't on your own move perhaps to the city, but this shock caused you to do so. So it's definitely a silver lining. It also makes us think from a policy perspective how to manage these displacement flows when conflict occurs, even for conflicts today. So the option of going into a refugee camp should really be seen as a very short-term solution, and given the long-term implications it can have on human capital acquisition. So perhaps thinking about alternative humanitarian strategies that enable individuals to be absorbed into better environments is an important policy implication, this type of work. But we also want to call attention to the fact that there are downsides, as you rightly said. So there are costs of this type of disruption. And what we find in this study in Mozambique is that even 30 years later, after the end of the war, those who were displaced still show lower levels of trust, civic attitudes, so the importance of voting, the importance of not engaging in corruption. We try to measure all of this today with a survey of individuals who were displaced during the war in Mozambique. And we find also that they have far lower levels of mental health. So they have higher anxiety, more loneliness. Even though presumably they moved to a city, to a better place, they are employed, acquired more education, have higher pay, but that these mental costs, psychological costs, are still quite significant.
Dominik, I'd like to talk about your research now. This happened in a very different place, didn't it? Where and when?
We looked at Finland in the aftermath of World War II. And as you mentioned, Tim, this is a very different place from Mozambique, but I do want to be clear that Finland, and in particular the areas that we focus on, were very rural and extremely poor. So It's not comparable to when you think Helsinki in 2025.
Yes, right.
We look into a particular region called Karelia, which was Finnish for many years. And then the army of the Soviet Union marched in twice, actually, in 1940 and again in 1944. And Finland had to cede about 10% of its eastern territory to the Soviet Union, which meant that about 11% of the Finnish population, so a large segment of the Finnish population, had to be resettled from these ceded areas further to the west.
And so this makes it a good candidate for, I suppose you call it a natural experiment.
Exactly, because what we are going to do in the study is that we basically compare the sons of fathers who lived in those ceded areas to sons who had fathers living in these neighboring municipalities right next to the new border who did not have to leave their homes. And so similar to what Sandra described about the Mozambique study, obviously, this is our attempt to find comparable cases, in our cases, comparable offspring of forcibly displaced migrants to people who were allowed to stay but come from very similar areas and without the displacement would probably have followed a very similar life trajectory.
Again, we're looking back into history. We're in a very rural area over a long period of time. Did you have the data? Where did you find it?
Yeah, so Sandra talked about the data challenges, which, were impressive and, even more impressive how you overcame them. In a way, they were not much smaller for us because what we were interested in was the intergenerational transmission.
Yeah.
So we don't look at the first generation, not because we don't think that's important, but because it has been studied by others, including Sandra. But we were wondering if some of these, if I might say, silver lining or positive effects on human capital that we find for the first generation transmits to the second generation, but also what happens to these negative consequences, including worse mental health, and is the second generation able to overcome that? What we have to do is first link fathers and sons, and I'll be very clear why this is such a male-focused sample in a minute.
Yeah.
Link fathers and sons over this first generation, then collect these outcome measures that we are interested in. And we really have a broad conceptualization of human capital, including, of course, education, but also including personality traits like motivation and leadership, including cognitive abilities, but also things like mental health, which obviously influence your success in life as well. And so we were able to link Finnish register data to get were for the sons living in the 70s and 80s, where their fathers were born and raised. And then because there is military conscription in Finland, which means that about 80% of all sons had to serve in the military, and that's the reason why we focus on sons. At the beginning of their military service, typically in week 6 or 8, they had to take a half-day-long exam which asks hundreds of questions, not just about their personality traits, but also about their mental health issues. And so that's the data that we are using in our study.
So what does the data tell us then about the outcomes for the sons?
Again, we're looking at the second generation, but in many ways, the effects on education resonate with what Sandra just talked about. So similar to the Mozambique case, what we find is that the sons of the displaced have higher education, which in Finland means more likely to complete university education or some other upper secondary degree, and less likely to just complete vocational training. Looking at these other dimensions of human capital that we have, we also find that they are more likely to have personality traits that are positively correlated with income, by which I mean things like a higher leadership skills, higher motivation, and also higher extraversion. One explanation for this is that if you're forced to move to a new place and meet new people, that obviously changes your approach to the world. And one interpretation of the data is that this not only affected fathers and mothers, but also something that they were able to pass on to their sons.
The mechanism that you're attributing to this, is it similar to what Sandra is finding?
One thing that we can do with our data is compare not just the sons of ceded areas from sons of non-ceded areas, but take into account the very elaborate resettlement policy of the Finns back then. Again, remember, this was rural Finland. And so what the Finns did in 1940 and 1944 is realizing that most of these people who had to be resettled were farmers. They actually measured the quality of the soil and the temperature and found matching municipalities with similar soil quality and similar temperature, such that the farmers could use the same technology that they were used to using in these new places. And not only that, but the Finns actually resettled entire villages to protect the social structure and social cohesion of these places. That's important, I think. The reason why I mentioned this is also for the interpretation of our non-negative effects of forced displacement a generation later, that I think in many ways here, we're really talking about a best case scenario. And the last piece, which I would like to emphasize because it comes out as very important in our analysis, is not only did they try to make sure as best as they could to find them a resettlement area that is similar in many ways and protect the social structure of the villages, gave people a plot of land, but they also gave them the freedom to sell that plot of land and move to other places. And that resonates with something that Sandra just described. So about 1/3 of the sons of the people from ceded areas grew up in the assigned resettlement area, but 2/3 made a secondary move. And these are exactly these secondary moves to opportunity. And what we find is that these positive effects are concentrated among those people who made a secondary move. And so I think that has real-world direct implications for how today we in European countries design our resettlement policies, because in the countries where we work, including Switzerland and Germany and Denmark, refugees typically are assigned to a particular municipality. That's where they have to live and that's where they have to work. The Finnish example shows that even if you try to match these resettlement areas to people's preferences, there's still a lot to be gained from giving them the freedom to move.
It's not something we generally think about, giving freedom to refugees. We think about giving them a place, and that's the end of the story, isn't it? So for both of you, we have two stories here that have some good and some bad in them, and different policy approaches based on expedience, but also on intention. Okay, the challenge is now there are going to be many more displaced people, certainly in Europe, certainly in the next couple of decades. How should we be thinking about policy towards them to help them maximize their opportunities in the future? Sandra?
So looking at my particular case in Mozambique, and more broadly, I think in sub-Saharan Africa, displacement will continue to occur due to conflict, primarily due to climate shocks as well. And so even though in many different countries now about maybe 80% of the population is in rural economies, in agriculture still, the expectation is that Africa is going to urbanize at an incredible rate. Up to 2050, we're talking about moving in some countries from a 10% urbanization rate up to 60% or 70%. And we're talking about just about 20 years. So to keep that in perspective, think about in Latin America, they had a similar process of rural to urban migration or displacement, but that took place at similar magnitudes for the course of 100 years. So this is something massive, big shocks that are going to occur, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. And I think we need to think about how to help manage, or the governments will have to think about how to help manage these inflows and directing resources to making cities more livable, places where people can acquire an education, where people can find jobs, should really be the front line of policy at the moment.
Because we know from, well, we can assume from what Dominik said and other evidence we have as well that people will choose to go to the cities.
They will choose to go to cities and they'll look for opportunities.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so if we want to avoid the type of urban poverty that we at times see in certain places, that we definitely need to think more carefully about how to make these cities capable of absorbing these large shocks. And I think for the most part, international organizations such as the UN system that tend to provide the humanitarian support to refugees and to displaced populations, they're moving away or trying to move away from the camp model, refugee camp or refugee settlement model, and try to think more broadly about having a developmental perspective of where do people need to go in order to live better lives in the long run.
I'm going to focus a little more on the European context. And there, I just find the contrast between what the Finns have done, very smartly in 1940s, so strong to what European countries are doing today. Most continental European countries, for the number of refugees that they accept, they have some kind of dispersal policies. And obviously, these dispersal policies vary a little bit across countries, but, the basic idea is always to assign refugees to particular municipalities and do so in a way that is roughly proportional to the size of these municipalities. And I think that has some intuitive appeal about sharing the responsibility for hosting refugees. But in most countries in Europe, refugees don't have a say on in which places they end up. And there are severe restrictions regarding moving to other places. The Finns back in the 1940s have done better on two important dimensions. One, they try to match refugees to their new places. In the Finnish context for farmers, but obviously, now with machine learning, there are ways to do this for everybody. That if we decide where you have to go, at least let's try to take your skills, your human capital into account to assign you to a place where you're most likely to thrive. But then also our study shows that even if you do that, there are huge benefits of letting those people who want to move because they might have some information about where they are most likely to thrive. And again, that's not the reality of what we find for refugees in many European countries where there are these restrictions on moving, right? And so I think there are huge benefits to be had, not just for the refugees, but also the host societies more general, if we had smarter allocation policies coupled with giving people the freedom to move.
Huge benefits if we just take note of what history's told us. So, Dominik, thank you.
Thank you.
And Sandra as well.
Thanks for having me.
So, two papers we've been discussing: civil conflict, forced displacement and human capital. Giorgio Chiavelli, Stelios Mikalopoulos, Elias Papagiannou and Sandra Sequeira. And the intergenerational effects of forced migration on human capital and personality traits, Dominik Hangartner, Ilona Ladelma, Marit Olkola and Matti Sevimäki.
Thanks for listening. The Rockwell Foundation Berlin Institute for the Economy and the Future of Work is providing new knowledge to inform public debate and to create the best possible basis for policy making. Find out more at rfberlin.com.